Félix Gallardo, the shadow king of the Mexican underworld. Two men are walking through the dense grass on a ranch in Michoacán state because they received secret information from an unnamed source about something hidden in this location. The sound of a shovel hitting the ground is rhythmic. They hadn't dug for long when a foul smell hidden beneath the soil hit the diggers' noses. And that smell was the odor of two dead bodies. One of them was the body of Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, an agent of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. He was a key figure who had infiltrated the Mexican drug trafficking network. But this man's undercover operation led to him being kidnapped in broad daylight, right in front of his wife and young child. And this was the reason his body had to be buried beneath the soil for over a month. His body was in terrible shape, bearing the signs of intense torture. His limbs were twisted and his eyes were tightly shut, as if still remembering the pain. This was a killing not born of anger, but from a calculated message by the perpetrators. That message was about extracting information and warning, "Don't mess with Mexico." The other body belonged to a Mexican man who served as a secret pilot for the DEA. He had been involved in previous investigative operations, and he was a key witness who could expose the drug trafficking routes. This news sent shockwaves across Mexico and the United States. The DEA was enraged and determined to hunt down those responsible. Local Mexican police cooperated with American officials to search for clues about the perpetrators. They tracked the trail to various crime scenes in the city of Guadalajara, and they found the location where Kiki had been held, tortured, and murdered. After finding the bodies, Mexican police and U.S. officials expanded their search to several locations. These were places where Kiki Camarena was believed to have been taken, and one of them was an abandoned house. When the officers finished searching the house, they came across something that would send shockwaves through the Mexican drug cartels, because they found a box. When the officers opened the box, they found a fake ID card, along with a photograph of a man attached. That was the photo of the man named Félix Gallardo, a former Mexican police officer who became the drug lord of the Guadalajara Cartel. Although not directly from the crime scene, this document became the beginning of linking him to Kiki's murder case. And this would expose the largest network of influence in Mexico. In a Texas MLY record, which had never been publicly released before, it stated, "We found this photograph tucked away in the evidence box, as if someone wanted it to be forgotten." Félix Gallardo wasn't just an ordinary drug trafficker. He was the designer or the architect of the drug trafficking system, known as the Plaza system, which united multiple drug trafficking groups to work together systematically. And Félix also transformed Mexico into the primary transit route for cocaine from Colombia to the United States. And this, indeed, was the beginning of the downfall of the Mexican drug empire. U.S. officials would never forget the face in that photograph. No one knew how this picture ended up there, or why someone carelessly allowed his photograph to be placed in that box. However, regardless of the motive or if it was an accident, what's certain is that this photograph led to a pursuit that shook the structure of drug trafficking, affecting both Mexico and the U.S. drug market, and it was the beginning of the end for the Guadalajara Cartel. This is the story of Félix Gallardo, the man who controlled everything from the shadows. Therefore, this man's story is not just about a drug dealer, but he was nicknamed the architect of Mexican drug trafficking, the man who united Mexican drug traffickers under what was called the Plaza, a controlled territorial division system that allowed various drug operations to coexist peacefully. Instead of fighting each other, it transformed Mexico from an illicit marijuana producer into a global cocaine transit empire. So this video series will take all viewers through the life of the man named Félix, from his beginnings through his dream of creating the Plaza, and the end of Félix Gallardo, which would ignite the drug war in Mexico that continues to this day, with The Watcher. I was curious about when the joint international effort to combat drug trafficking began and which countries participated. This led to important information regarding the history of drug suppression. Its beginning occurred at an international conference in The Hague, Netherlands, held between 1911 and 1914, with over 46 countries participating to lay the groundwork for international policy regarding the drug problem, and joint suppression efforts that are still in effect today. However, In that conference, no Latin American countries participated, despite them being major producers and suppliers globally. Of course, the US believed that to stop drug trafficking, they had to stop it at the source. This resulted in 44 countries out of the total 46 agreeing at the conference 100 years ago. Among the 46 participating countries, they shared a single hope: to make the world drug-free. But in practice, we all know it failed. Latin American countries are considered the core of this problem, and only Mexico made a serious attempt to shift things, even though that effort was merely a policy that was not seriously implemented, because they faced a major obstacle called the economy, which led to corruption thriving in this kind of environment. Corruption is like a parasite that infiltrates conducive environments. And if a country faces economic problems, the parasite named corruption will interfere. And it often embeds itself within the bureaucracy and the police force. This is what criminal groups highly desire. A few years after the Hague Convention, Mexico began a policy to ban opium imports in 1916. President Venustiano Carranza attempted to enforce it, but ultimately the measure became just a declaration before eventually fading into memory, because nothing came of it. Even though the Mexican government had some success in drug suppression, ultimately they couldn't stop the drug trade. What they managed to achieve was only a fraction of what was needed. Therefore, saying they would eliminate drugs is like saying they would eliminate all cockroaches in the country. Drug-related income was estimated to be around 20–25% of Mexico's GDP, over half. 70 years passed, and countless meetings were held to solve the drug problem. However, drug traffickers were shipping goods faster. Everything remained the same. The growing drug culture in Mexico inevitably seeped across the border into Texas. A DEA agent stated that their officers were constantly seizing drugs being shipped to Texas. These drugs were consistently linked to Félix Gallardo's cartel, and the southern area of Texas became a money laundering hub for Mexican drug traffickers. This is what US officials had to confront, especially in the Texas area. But at the same time, the people of Mexico had a saying: "You can't have a diving board without a swimming pool." This phrase implied that Mexico accepted its country as the site for drug traffickers. But none of this would happen if Americans didn't demand drugs. So Mexicans turned their country into the diving board, and the swimming pool was the United States. This is what occurred before the 1980s. It was the time before Félix Gallardo became a major drug trafficker. On January 8, 1946, a poor family gave birth to the boy who would become a kingpin, named Miguel Angel Félix Gallardo. His diary recounted a childhood facing poverty and a lack of opportunities, challenges faced by Mexican citizens like him and his family. This became a major issue, leading to the rise of criminals and crime problems, because a bad economy is the first step toward corruption. Robbery, theft, and drug trafficking, as well as murder. These problems tend to flourish in such environments, especially in areas like Mexico. No, I think worldwide the problem of corruption is often embedded in the bureaucracy and the police force. This is precisely what criminal groups desire most. Of course, Félix grew up amidst violence. Gang murders were a daily occurrence. Just crossing the line to sell in someone else's territory, that person would face death. This was the problem of Mexican cartels, where no one yielded to anyone else, and the government was unable to solve this problem. This led to drug trafficking problems by various gangs erupting all over Mexico. They fought over profits and territories, and this is what made the Mexican drug market so unstable. Goods lacked quality because different people were planting and producing independently, leading to inconsistent product quality. And the boy, Félix, grew up in this kind of society, and he understood the insights of the drug cartels, including the perspective of politicians, because from the government's point of view they disliked the violence occurring in various areas. And Félix knew well that politicians wanted peace, because it would build their political base, implying that this politician helped bring peace to the city. Therefore, the young Félix had an idea and a dream to solve this problem in the future, by creating something called the plaza. But what is the plaza? I will reveal that later. When Félix was 17, he became a local police officer and started working for the government as a federal police officer in Mexico. No one knows whether the reason he became a police officer was because he wanted to uphold justice or because he wanted to control the law. But even so, it was written that the department Félix was in had a notorious reputation for corruption. Additionally, Félix's police salary at the time was insufficient for survival, so he decided to seek additional income. And for a police officer, making extra money could only mean one thing, apart from accepting bribes from the cartels, to find a way out of poverty. This is what they believed all along. Well, regardless of whether Félix's actions were justified or not, what's certain is that this decision would lead him fully into the world of crime, and it opened the door for him to work as a bodyguard for the governor of Sinaloa, Leopoldo Sanchez Celis. Later, Félix met Pedro Perez. This man was a drug trafficker in Sinaloa who knew the governor, but at the same time he was known as a drug smuggler, and the meeting of these two, you can probably picture what it would lead to, right? The answer is the entry of the man named Félix Gallardo into the drug trade. He began working for the drug cartel, starting as an intermediary to coordinate with government officials and the cartel, by clearing transport routes and bribing colleagues. Before he got to know Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, or Don Neto, these two men had previously worked for Avilés's gang, who was currently the leader of a group in Sinaloa. Then Félix met this drug lord, and their acquaintance would draw him into the drug trade, and it would be a complete descent into the dark side. Before he diverted to a business like growing marijuana and opium in the remote mountains of Sinaloa, but eventually his drug farm was destroyed by the government, under the famous operation known as Operation Condor, which was an operation to destroy opium production in Mexico. So Félix's marijuana and opium farm was not the only place that was raided, but it included the whole country. Soon after, Avilés Perez hired Félix to manage his marijuana and heroin business. But then in 1978, it seemed like fate granted the throne to Félix, because Perez died in a shootout with the police. And this is how Félix Gallardo took over the business and gradually began to understand the Mexican drug trade system, because Félix's goal was no longer just Sinaloa. This led to the concept called the plaza, which I will explain simply as everyone in the cartel collaborating as a federation, where each cartel in Mexico would take responsibility for transportation, production, and distribution. Each cartel would have different duties so that no one would kill each other over profits. Félix believed that the unification of the cartels in Mexico through the plaza system would make Mexico strong and united under a single cartel called the Guadalajara Cartel. But that dream was never easy. Félix Gallardo, along with his two assistants, Rafael Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, had to travel to contact various cartels across Mexico and explain the goals and the benefits that each cartel would receive. Due to Félix's great oratory skills, many cartels decided to cooperate, and eventually, after traveling all over Mexico, every cartel agreed that they should stop pointing guns at each other and create a strong federation together, under the unification of the Mexicans. And eventually it led to the major cartel Guadalajara, under the overall management of Félix Gallardo. The cartels that joined this concept included the Arellano Félix family, Rafael Caro Quintero, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Leiva family and Ismael Zambada, including the man named Joaquin Guzman, whom we all know as El Chapo, among others. This was the largest drug trafficking alliance network, highly protected. They were united and had almost no internal conflicts, which made them extremely wealthy. All of this was under the administration of Félix Gallardo for transporting drugs to the United States and worldwide. That is, marijuana, opium, and in the future, cocaine. As a result of the unification, by the mid-1980s, the Guadalajara Cartel had become the largest group. Félix Gallardo and his assistants modernized the drug trade system. They expanded their trade base to foreign countries. They established drug trafficking routes from South America, through Mexico, to the United States and the European continent. These routes are still in use today. In a way, Félix Gallardo was different from all the Mexican drug traffickers before him, because he understood market mechanisms, especially the strengths and weaknesses of the Mexican drug trade. He viewed the global drug market through the lens of a Wall Street investor, with a clear market analysis which allowed Félix to speak their language, the language of investors. And Félix's rise gave the Mexican drug trade an influence over the drug market that continues to this day. All right, once the internal organization was strong, Félix began to buy off people in the government, because, as I mentioned, the economy is the loophole for corruption. Of course, Félix understood this nature well, so he began laying the foundation for a system of corruption. And he started bribing powerful people in the Mexican government. This would help protect their mutual interests based on the principle called pacta mafiosa, or the mafia peace. This system would involve cooperation between the government and the Guadalajara Cartel, where the cartel would guarantee a certain level of peace if those in power helped them maintain their production of goods, even when facing challenges from smaller rival criminal groups. This was a promise that violence would not occur, and the government had to facilitate everything for the Guadalajara Cartel. After Félix unified the cartels and had government backing, his next step was to transform the money laundering process into a legitimate economy. Félix's money laundering base would be located north and south of the border between Mexico and the United States. Choosing this area as a strategic point for money laundering would bring a man into a significant role, and he would become Félix's successor in the future. This man was El Mayo and El Chapo. The Pacific coastal area of Sinaloa has rugged terrain, making it difficult to access, especially having a very long coastline which made it suitable for illegal activities, such as cultivation and the illicit trafficking of drugs. Félix would use this advantage to pioneer drug trafficking routes, and he started thinking big by building relationships with drug traffickers from Colombia, namely the Cali Cartel and the Medellin Cartel of the man named Pablo Escobar. In the business world, having alliances is extremely important, as it is in the world of drug trafficking. Connections and alliances are the power of the drug industry. And Félix Gallardo understood what I just said faster than all the Mexican drug traffickers of that era, because during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the world of cocaine was in the hands of Colombian drug traffickers. That is, the gentlemen of the Cali Cartel and the ruthless Medellin Cartel of Pablo Escobar. They originally transported goods through the Caribbean Sea and landed them in Florida. But when the United States and the DEA increased pressure to combat drug trafficking, news emerged that they might close the route that Colombian drug traffickers used to transport to the U.S. This forced both cartels to find a new way to transport their goods. As for Félix Gallardo, after establishing stability in Mexico, he started to seriously study this issue. And he saw a crucial variable in this equation: Mexico. It was the new answer for both cartels, because of the complex terrain and the long border, combined with officials who could be bought with cash. Félix Gallardo saw the opportunity before anyone else. Thus, his status was no longer just a drug trafficker or the leader of the Guadalajara group, but he was an excellent problem solver and a visionary businessman. Moreover, Félix Gallardo, the former police officer, who knew how to set up the bureaucratic system to favor dark business, was able to build relationships with high-ranking officials at both the state and federal levels, which made Félix a worthwhile investment in the eyes of the Colombians. But even so, nothing came easy. Félix offered a solution to the Cali cartel by shipping cocaine from Colombia across the Mexican border, and then using land routes to cross into America, so the Colombian cartels wouldn't have to rely on the sea route anymore, and Félix guaranteed that their goods would be safer and less risky. Plus, the under-the-table payments were less. But at the same time, Félix Gallardo also decided to ship goods for Pablo Escobar. Although the series Narcos depicted a meeting between Félix Gallardo and Pablo Escobar, the famous Colombian drug kingpin, who kidnapped Félix for negotiation. However, experts in this field say it's highly unlikely that Félix was kidnapped and experienced what was shown in the series. Nevertheless, Félix's arrival made the Guadalajara cartel even greater. It was a win-win deal for both sides, and Félix became a continental intermediary, said to be the first person to connect Colombia to the U.S. drug market, through the intermediary of Mexico. And what followed was an endless flow of money. This was the beginning of the golden age of the Guadalajara Cartel, and from now on Félix was nicknamed the architect who designed that system. A system that still haunts the Mexican government to this day. However, there is no doubt that the cooperation between Félix Gallardo and the various drug cartels made his business extremely strong. Moreover, the Mexican Intelligence Agency, DFS, also protected the Guadalajara Cartel's drug operations to prevent them from facing major problems during drug transport as long as Félix Gallardo continued to pay. In a way, the corruption process helped Félix's drug operations avoid problems, especially being arrested and imprisoned. But when something goes up, it inevitably falls down. And what follows is the downfall of Félix Gallardo. It began with the man named Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar. Félix Gallardo's colossal drug empire included a marijuana farm called Rancho Buffalo, which was enormous, with reports indicating it spanned over 1,344 acres. And this marijuana farm produced yields valued at more than $8 billion per year. According to a report by The Atlantic, they shipped goods to Tijuana and then forwarded them to the destination, the United States. But one day, Mexican government officials along with the DEA destroyed the Buffalo farm. This inflicted enormous damage on the Guadalajara Cartel, and this group of Mexican drug traffickers would certainly not tolerate it. As a result, on February 7, 1985, a group of Mexican officials who were bribed by Félix Gallardo's cartel kidnapped the U.S. DEA agent Kiki Camarena. After learning that Kiki Camarena had infiltrated the cartel, he was able to gather information about the drug transport routes, as well as powerful government officials who accepted bribes from Félix's cartel. Furthermore, this kidnapping was a direct retaliation for the destruction of the Buffalo marijuana farm, because Kiki Camarena played a significant role in leading that raid. And the loss of the farm caused Rafael Caro Quintero to be extremely angry with Kiki for destroying his marijuana farm. After Kiki Camarena was captured, they took Kiki away to interrogate, torture, and kill him. There is evidence that the CIA knew what would happen to Kiki, but they did nothing. The reason they didn't warn him was to protect their own sources, and this led to the relationship between the two agencies, the CIA and the DEA, becoming strained. Well, regardless of the truth behind Kiki Camarena's death, or whether the CIA knew about the incident beforehand, Kiki's disappearance led Washington to demand that the Mexican government do something and arrest anyone involved in the kidnapping of Kiki Camarena Salazar. Witness testimony reported that high-ranking officials from the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of the Interior in Mexico were also complicit in the murder of Kiki Camarena, even though the accusations against high-ranking officials in the Mexican government were never proven. The pressure from the U.S. led the Mexican government at that time to decide to dissolve the DFS intelligence agency and replace it with a new police force, which was also later corrupted. 1 month later, after Kiki Camarena's disappearance, finally, DEA officials found Kiki's body in a horrifying state. His body was severely beaten, and subsequent autopsy revealed that his skull, jawbone, nose, cheekbones, and windpipe were severely battered. His body also had several broken ribs. Most notably, the forensic examiners found a hole in Kiki's head, believed to have been drilled by a power drill. Not long after the discovery of Kiki Camarena's body, Félix Gallardo became a key suspect. Officials found the photograph I mentioned earlier. Félix Gallardo wrote in his memoir about the time he was detained by DEA officials, saying, "I was taken to the DEA agency. I greeted them and they wanted to talk to me. I only replied that I had no involvement whatsoever in the case of Kiki Camarena. And I said that only a madman would do such a thing, but I am not mad. I sincerely regret the loss of your man." In Félix Gallardo's eyes, he knew that killing a DEA agent was bad for business, and he always chose business over violence. As the supreme leader who built the Guadalajara Cartel, he had no desire to put his empire at risk, especially risk coming from the United States. Mexican government officials who accepted bribes could not protect Félix or his cartel. If America went on a rampage, this was the condition that Félix Gallardo understood very well. However, regardless of his involvement, US DEA officials believed Félix was involved in this matter. This led to the formation of a special team to arrest those responsible for the murder of Kiki Camarena, known as Operation Leyenda. It was the largest mission in DEA history. Not long after the murder in 1985, someone finally had to take responsibility. And the two men who had to take responsibility for the murder case of Kiki Camarena were Don Nito and Caro, the pioneering leaders alongside Félix. It is said that Félix sold both men out to the Mexican police to close the case of Kiki Camarena's kidnapping and murder, which would allow his organization to continue operating. And it also helped restore political relations between Félix and powerful Mexican government officials. But after this incident, the cartels that were once united began to fracture, starting with Héctor Luis Palma Salazar, who became the first defector to leave the Guadalajara Cartel in 1988. He broke away to establish his own organization and betrayed Félix Gallardo, the man who used to be his boss. Previously, Palma was Félix's bodyguard, so Palma's betrayal made him extremely angry. And this was the first structural breakdown in the hierarchical criminal organization that was once stable. And this was the decline of Félix Gallardo. A few months after Palma defected, Félix Gallardo was arrested. This incident happened on April 8, 1989. Mexican authorities arrested him at his home while Félix was still wearing a bathrobe. The police officers Félix had bribed refused to take Félix's calls, and some high-ranking leaders cut ties with Félix. This meant that Félix Gallardo had been abandoned by those in power. Félix Gallardo wrote in his memoir about the incident of his arrest, saying, "3 officers came up to him and threw him to the floor. Then they beat his face with the butt of a rifle." He wrote this in his notebook about his arrest after living in prison. When Félix Gallardo was arrested, he had assets worth over $500 million and was charged by officials in Mexico and the US with kidnapping and murdering Kiki Camarena, as well as extortion, drug smuggling, and multiple acts of violent crime. Therefore, the arrest of Félix Gallardo acted as a catalyst to expose corrupt officials. Within a few days after Félix Gallardo was arrested, and under pressure from the media, several police commanders were arrested, and it is said that more than 90 officers fled Mexico. Félix Gallardo was sentenced to 40 years in prison, and after serving 28 years, Félix Gallardo was tried again in 2017. And he was sentenced to an additional 37 years in prison. But even so, he brutally retaliated against the man who betrayed him by ordering his men to murder Palma's wife and 2 children, then sending the wife's head to Palma. This created intense hatred and became the beginning of an endless cycle of violence. Even though Félix Gallardo is now arrested, he still wields power to command from inside the prison. The architect of the Guadalajara Cartel still allocated territories for smuggling goods along the border into the United States by dividing it into various zones. He assigned his relatives, the Arellano-Félix family, to oversee the Tijuana area, including the San Diego area in the United States. The Leiva family controlled the Sonora area towards Arizona in the east. Fuentes, or the Lord of the Skies, was assigned the transport route from Ciudad Juárez to El Paso in Texas. The Pacific Coast and Sinaloa were handed over to close associates who were currently on the rise, such as El Mayo and El Chapo, who would start playing significant roles from now on. The eastern area of Tamaulipas was given to a cartel like the Gulf Cartel under the management of Garcia Abrego, but Félix's departure would cause the plaza system they built to collapse. Because these various cartels were not inherently meant to work together seamlessly, and this marked the beginning of the end for the once stable, old and tight-knit mafia cartel group, leading to the drug war that has raged ever since. In a way, the arrest of Félix Gallardo led to the dissolution of the Guadalajara Cartel, as the main members of this federation decided to withdraw and establish their own cartels. They would rely on violence and claiming rights over various territories, and the best trading and transport routes, therefore the late 1980s through the 1990s, were considered a period of chaos, violence and murders among the drug cartels, which still has consequences today. And the cartels of El Chapo and Amado Carrillo Fuentes were about to rise from this point, All right, after my explanation, I will summarize it to make it easier to understand again. Before this, various cartels in Mexico would compete for the drug market among themselves. Their products were marijuana and opium, with some scattered cocaine. Their goods were shipped to the United States. But Félix Gallardo came in and united all the cartels under one roof, the Guadalajara Cartel, forming a federation with shared responsibilities and receiving profits from the central pool that Félix controlled. This allowed them to control the price of goods, creating a strong system. Later, when Félix saw news of the Caribbean route closure, he approached Colombia to propose a solution for transporting goods to the Cali and Medellin cartels of Pablo Escobar. So in this equation, if the US was the customer and Colombia was the producer, Mexico, under Félix's leadership, was the middleman, the logistics system for delivering the goods to their destination, that is, the United States. But Félix didn't stop there. He wanted to expand the product line for Mexico. So he started accepting payment in cocaine to change Mexico's status regarding shipments to the United States. This is what made Mexico's name grow big in the drug trade. But when Félix fell, the federation shattered. Each faction became independent. Although there was no immediate violence as time passed, each faction began to think, why should we concede good transport routes to the other side? And this indeed led to the beginning of the new era of the drug war in Mexico, which continues to have consequences to this day. After the departure of Félix Gallardo, Mexico is now in a new era under the leadership of El Chapo, of the Sinaloa cartel controlling most of the Mexican drug market. It is said that El Chapo's cartel controls more than half of the Mexican drug market. El Chapo is known for his ruthlessness and strategies. One example is the excavation of tunnels several kilometers long for transporting drugs, right along the border between Mexico and the United States border. El Chapo's cartel would choose houses closest to the border and use that house in Mexico as a route for transporting drugs through underground tunnels. The tunnel would then exit at a house right next to the U.S. border. This method allowed El Chapo to reduce the risk of being arrested and clashing with rival cartels who wanted to steal El Chapo's drug shipments. It saves money, reduces risks from danger, and allows them to ship large quantities of goods. Another group that broke away from Félix's group was the Arellano-Félix family. The Arellano family consists of 10 siblings. The eldest brother was Francisco Arellano Félix, who became the leader after Félix was arrested. However, this leader also had to spend his life in prison, just like Félix Gallardo, because he was arrested in 1993. The next leaders were Benjamin and Ramon. These new generation leaders used different business methods than the old generation. This new generation of leaders focused on using violence, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, especially launching a war against El Chapo. It is recorded that the Arellano family bribed government officials up to $1 million per week. In addition, Benjamin invented a new system called franchising for transporting drugs to the U.S. by distributing them across various areas. And because the Arellano family's territory bordered the U.S., they could collect tolls and protection fees from other drug traffickers, who had to rely on their routes to transport drugs to the U.S. And this led to conflicts, especially with El Chapo's Sinaloa group, because this man refused to pay tribute to Benjamin. And this led to several violent incidents, one of which occurred in 1992, when El Chapo sent over 40 gunmen to attack the Arellano brothers group at a nightclub, killing 9 people, but the Arellano brothers eventually survived. In 1993, Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo was shot and killed at the Guadalajara airport. This cardinal died from stray bullets that came from the war between the Arellano family and El Chapo. The death of this cardinal led the Mexican government to seriously declare war on the cartels, and this led to El Chapo being arrested in 1993, before Palma followed El Chapo into prison in 1995. In addition to the 2 groups that rose to fame after Félix left, there was another group that slowly built itself up, until it became one of the most important cartels in the Mexican drug trade. That is the Fuentes group, known as the Lord of the Skies. This man was the pioneer of air transporting drugs from Colombia to the U.S. by flying over the skies of Mexico. He was a former close associate of Félix Gallardo, who had been part of the Guadalajara Cartel for a long time. But when Félix left, Amado started building his own empire, making his cartel stable. And it became one of the most influential cartels in Mexico, using El Paso and Ciudad Juárez as its base of operations. His organization is known as the Juárez Cartel, which had over 3,300 members. These 3,300 members were divided into 400 small groups across various cities in Mexico. Each unit performed different duties, forming an extremely strong network. Amado's cartel was also protected by high-ranking Mexican officials. One of them was General Jesus Gutierrez Rebolo. This man was appointed as the Tsar of the Mexican drug trade. Before this, General was arrested in February 1997 on corruption charges, and the departure of this man would cause many drug cartels that used to pay the general to suffer greatly. Entering July 1997. Suddenly the DEA received a report that Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, the leader of the Juárez cartel, had died mysteriously on the operating table while undergoing facial plastic surgery, but a theory emerged that Fuentes had not died, and the news of his death was just a ruse. He underwent plastic surgery and escaped to live peacefully somewhere in South America, and his departure caused the Juárez cartel to gradually lose its power significantly, although Vicente Fuentes, his younger brother, took over as the next leader. This man couldn't maintain the loyalty of his men. Furthermore, the relationships between the cartels were never permanent, because peace only lasts when there are win-win benefits for both sides. But as long as one side is weak, the other side is ready to take over the operation. And since 2004, the Juárez cartel and El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel officially opened hostilities. The last group to break away from Félix Gallardo was the cartel of Juan Nepomuceno Guerra. If I mispronounce the Spanish name, I apologize. This man was an influential figure in the drug cartel, and he had been in this business for a long time, starting with smuggling liquor across the border during the era when America banned alcohol sales, or during the era of Al Capone. Later, in the 1980s, his network evolved significantly by moving into the cocaine business through his nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego. This man had built a good relationship with the Cali cartel of Colombia. Most importantly, this cartel could also bribe Mexican government officials and the Mexican Attorney General's office. This gave them a lot of influence. In 1989, according to DEA information, Juan Garcia Abrego's cartel could transport up to 40 tons of cocaine into America per year. However, in 1996, Juan Garcia Abrego was arrested and extradited across the border to the United States. He is said to be one of the first drug traffickers to be placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. However, when the old leader left, a new leader took his place. The new leader was named Osiel Cárdenas Guillén, and again, if I mispronounce the name, I apologize. This man was a police informant, and in 2001, Cárdenas was able to gather his forces by winning over elite soldiers from the Mexican Special Forces unit who were sent to arrest him. However, Cárdenas was able to change their minds and convince them to join his cartel. And of course, Cárdenas's new soldiers would become the Special Forces unit for Cárdenas's cartel, under the name Los Zetas, which became a notorious commando unit for the drug cartel, because this commando unit wore distinctive masks. Before Cárdenas built a drug alliance network, this made his cartel famous and highly influential. In summary, the Mexican drug trafficking organizations have a diverse structure, both at the individual level, with specialized expertise and extending to large networks. They have an administrative structure similar to a large corporation with a hierarchy for sharing profits. All of these things came from the mastermind of Félix Gallardo. This is why he earned the nickname the architect of Mexican drug trafficking. Especially during the 1980s, Félix began establishing a strong hierarchical structure, with centralized authority transfer and also controlling the market, transport system, and prices, according to the Mexican market mechanisms. However, when Félix left and entering the late 1990s, various cartels started vying for power. This led to the Mexican drug war between the four cartels I mentioned. And the conflicts continue to have consequences to this day, because the Mexican drug market has enormous value, and all factions want to dominate it and be the biggest players in this market. And the violence continues to rage to this day. Currently, El Chapo is serving a life sentence in a prison in Colorado, United States. Although he successfully escaped from prison before, he was eventually recaptured and sent back to a place he will never leave again. As for Felix, the latest news emerged on September 12, 2022. The aging Felix, who had lost one eye, was approved to be transferred from prison in Mexico to house arrest. NBC News was granted permission to interview Félix Gallardo, at age 75, in early August 2021. The former supreme leader said, "My body is now half paralyzed. I have lost sensation, I have lost my hearing, and I have lost my sight." When the reporter asked if he had any part in the Kiki Camarena case, the elderly Félix Gallardo replied, "It's been over 32 years. That's a lifetime for a man who didn't commit a crime, and I did nothing wrong. So I have nothing to regret because I was not involved in that event, in the murder of Kiki Camarena." And this is the story of Félix Gallardo,